Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Greta Kirdulytė, and I'm happy to be presenting on the topic of microcredentials to you today, which is a growing topic in the EU and its member states, as well as around the globe. Before getting into the presentation, I would like to shortly introduce myself. I'm a senior researcher at PPMI, and PPMI is the leading European research and policy analysis center. We help public sector presenting evidence in a way that is simple, clear, and ready to use. Our team provides services during all phases of the policy cycle, which is policy formulation, decision-making, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. My work at PPMI is mainly concentrated in the areas of higher education, research and innovation, and more recently vocational education and training, as well as employability. I have an educational background in social sciences, more specifically bachelor's degrees in politics and international relations, as well as master's in international security. In early 2020, PPMI and me personally have started working on the topic of microcredentials, as it was gaining attention in the circles of European policy makers. I'm currently coordinating a set of a project on microcredentials and their role in facilitating learning for employment. Under this project, our team is implementing 3 strands of work, which are mapping microcredentials to labor market-related education and training, microcredentials and evolving qualifications frameworks, as well as the added value of microcredentials for end users. However, today I will be talking and concentrating on the work done for NESET Analytical report, which is called Towards a European Approach to Microcredentials, a study of practices and commonalities in offering microcredentials in European higher education, and the main findings of this report. As per request of the European Commission and as part of NESET activities, together with Dominic Orr and Mantas Pupinis, I have co-authored this report. But before getting into more details about the report, I would like to shortly present what NESET is. It is an advisory network of experts working on the social dimension of education and training, which was set up at the initiative of the European Commission's Directorate General for Education and Culture. As information about microcredentials was rather scarce at the time in the European context, DGAC asked us to provide some background analysis, informing them regarding the development, provision, and recognition of microcredentials. The report is based on a review of recent literature that analyzes it, 3 case studies of recent notable practices related to microcredentials, such as an introduction of microcredentials in New Zealand's education and training system, which will be presented to you a bit later in more detail. Also, EduBadges pilot, as well as microcredentialing solutions under European Universities Initiative. And we also combined a list of notable practices related to microcredentials. The report tried to answer 4 main research questions. First, what notable practices exist in relation to implementation of microcredentials? Second, what could be the benefits of the growing provision of microcredentials? Third, what are the main obstacles to the provision of microcredentials in higher education and by other education providers? And number 4 is, if the EU policymakers create a European approach governing and harmonizing the use of microcredentials, which aspects should fall under this approach and why? In order to answer the main research questions and how the European Commission could address the issue with a potential policy initiative on microcredentials, we have used an analytical framework, because we first needed to conceptualize the possible roles and purposes of microcredentials in higher education. For this, we have identified 3 scenarios for the use of microcredentials. First scenario is the recognition within one education system. Second scenario is the recognition within education system as well as the labor market. And third, is their recognition within the education system, the labor market, and the society at large. These scenarios were based on the work of one of our co-authors, Dominic Orr, and his colleagues Brun and Buchem. Scenario 1 refers to a scenario with the smallest scope. The scenario is aimed at learners who want to document and map their skills and competencies within the higher education system while using microcredentials. Scenario 1 has the advantage of being relatively easy and quick to implement and may help universities to be more responsive to the emergence of new skills or knowledge domains, such as the artificial intelligence, fintech, and others. On the other hand, Scenario 1 may not deliver work-ready graduates with the types of skills and knowledge required by employers, due to the main gap existing between theory and practice, an education system, and the labor market. Scenario 2 refers to a possible scenario of medium scope. Scenario 2 is an extension of Scenario 1, in which the use of microcredentials in one system is already assumed. It has the potential to mitigate some of the challenges that Europe is currently facing in the context of skills, such as skills mismatch and skills gap, and to make people's skill profiles more visible. The possible challenge to implementing Scenario 2 could be in arriving at common standards and descriptions of achievements. However, this risk could be mitigated by ensuring that microcredentials are well described and quality assured. The third scenario is a more efficient version of what can be achieved by Scenario 2. In this scenario, digital certificates might replace traditional CVs and become part of an individual's digital portfolio or digital identity. The conditions required for Scenario 3 must enable the cross-system use of microcredentials for lifelong learning in the European context, by developing methods and tools for recording, processing, and recognizing skills and competencies that are acquired through education, employment, as well as informal and non-formal activities, such as volunteering. Scenario 3 is the scenario best positioned to advance the development of lifelong learning, but it has a disadvantage of being the hardest to implement, because it would require the implementation between and across all systems within a time frame that can respond to current needs. And implementing it across three systems, which are education system, labor market, and the society at large, is the most complicated. The relative likelihood of the scenarios which were described in the previous slide depend on the way in which higher education is organized, as well as the ways in which it is currently provided and how it will be provided in the future. The study suggests 4 future scenarios based on different profiles for higher education provision. This is mainly determined by the learning pathway of the learner throughout their life. The study refers to the concepts of both the 100-year lifespan and the 60-year curriculum. These terms highlight the fact that higher education institutions are encouraged to think beyond degree-based programs and to consider how value can be provided to learners across the entire lifetime. These changes are necessary because people's work and personal lives are no longer linear. Higher education institutions need to serve learners over the course of their lifetime to ensure that they are employable in the light of ever-evolving nature of work, as well as the need for personal development. 4 learning pathway models for higher education discussed in our study are Tamagotchi, Jenga, Lego set, and Transformer. In the first model, called Tamagotchi, the learner has typically finished secondary schooling and progress onto higher education. They enroll in one institution and study relatively intensively for a period of 3 to 5 years, leading to the completion of the higher education program in which they have enrolled. Most learning following this first block is informal and non-formal, and is not directly linked to the first study program that they have done. This model follows the traditional concept of higher education, which assumes that the knowledge and skills learned in higher education give the learner a competency profile which is future-proof and which will allow them to adapt flexibly to the future demands of the labor market. In the second model, that we call Jenga, the learner has typically finished secondary schooling and progresses on to higher education. They study relatively intensively for a period of 3 years or less at a single higher education institution. The focus is on helping them to acquire foundational knowledge and skills. Throughout their lives, these learners will top up this knowledge via short programs, possibly leading to micro-credentials. Together, these activities make up a complete program of study that balances foundational and transversal knowledge and skills with upskilling and sideways skilling as necessary for the individual's current occupation. Formal recognition of the first learning block is certain. Recognition of other learning units depends on the way in which recognition is organized within the higher education landscape. In the third model, which we called LEGO, the learner is highly self-motivated and self-reliant and wishes to piece together their own full study program, taking advantage of offerings available and earning credentials from different various education providers. The chain of learning units completed by the learner describes their own personal study program. Recognition of the learning units depends on the way in which recognition is organized within the higher education landscape. The learner might also choose to earn additional credentials in order to change their careers or upskill in his or her existing career path. In the fourth model, which is called Transformer, there is a long break between the learner's period at school and an initial training and a new learning period. They are returning to higher education either to gain new foundational knowledge and skills or to improve the level of their formal education. This may be motivated by the need to change careers or upskill in their career path. They study relatively intensively for a period of 3 to 5 years and then complete their higher education program with the expectation of returning to or re-entering the labor market. This type of higher education provision satisfies the demand from individual learners for the chance to transform their knowledge and skills profiles in order to upskill significantly or to change their career pathway. Also, to re-enter the labor market. It could also be driven by the demands of an employer requesting that an employee adjust their knowledge and competency profile, which is expected to be higher than it currently is. In this case, it makes sense to recognize some of the learner's previous learning and competencies in the design of the learning program. The study showed that there are many different terms used to describe what this report calls micro-credentials. As you can see, the main synonyms that we identified are alternative credentials, digital badges, micro-certificates, open badges, mini degrees, nano degrees, micromasters, industry, and professional certificates. And for the purpose of this report, we considered a broader scope of credentials to have a better overview of what actually exists. So when looking at micro-credentials, we also considered these existing credentials. In order to better reflect on the topic of micro-credentials and avoid the confusion, the report distinguished between learning activities, achievements, and contributions, which include short learning courses that may lead to micro-credentials, and between micro-credentials themselves as proof of learning. So we explained further that these are documents that recognize the learning activities that took place and the learning outcomes resulting from these learning activities. Why we did that? It is because the focus on certifications as distinct from simply learning activities could be regarded as closer to the everyday understanding of the concept of micro-credentials and credentials themselves. This distinction is important because it clarifies that micro-credentials are documents and a proof of learning rather than learning activities themselves. However, in the discussions on micro-credentials, we have noticed that learning activities that lead to micro-credentials are also an important topic. Thus, we look at both in our report. The study has also found that there are 3 main considerations when talking about micro-credentials. More specifically, these are related to the limited length of learning activities leading to a micro-credential, which are always larger than a single course, but less than a full degree. Also, they have to have labor market relevance. The focus is on the delivery of specific knowledge, skills, and competencies that are useful in the labor market context. And third, they are also often having a wider societal impact. So the focus is quite often on lifelong learning opportunities that are reasonably priced, short, and convenient to access to the learners. Despite identifying the main characteristics of microcredentials, the study also found that there are no universally agreed definition of microcredentials. But I will provide to you an example of what the European Commission defines as microcredentials. So according to this definition, microcredentials are a proof of learning that a learner has acquired after short learning experience. The learning outcomes have been assessed against transparent standards. The proof is contained in a certified document that lists the name of the holder, the achieved learning outcomes, the assessment method, the awarding body, and also, where applicable, the qualifications framework level, as well as the number of credits gained. Microcredentials are owned by the learner. They can be shared, are portable, and may combined into a larger credential or qualification. They are underpinned by quality assurance following agreed standards. And this definition of the European Commission was formulated with a goal to encompass key characteristics for the uptake of microcredentials so that they are trusted among the users. The inclusion of learning outcomes, quality assurance, and assessment aspects in this definition signals that microcredentials are expected to be adhering to the same standards as traditional qualifications, which of course makes them trusted, understood by the end users, which are learners and employers. Before getting into more details, I would like to present to you the summary of what currently existing microcredentials are based on our overall findings. First, we looked at what microcredentials are, and we found that they are a proof of knowledge, skills, and competencies, both new and prior. The knowledge, skills, and competencies can be gained in a variety of settings, which are online, on-site, and blended. It can be learning activities in a classroom-based setting, online course, or even the job training. These learning activities can be provided by different types of providers, which include traditional education providers such as universities or vocational schools, industry providers such as employer organizations and companies, or private providers such as different learning platforms, NGOs, and other organizations. Microcredentials themselves can be issued in a paper or digital certificates or digital badges. They can also be for standalone validation, which means that they are issued for achievement that is not related to formal qualifications, or they can be for validation that interacts with formal qualifications, or for learning necessary for the admission and preparation for formal qualifications. Even though microcredentials are a proof of learning, the study found that the learning activities that lead to microcredentials are themselves a major topic when talking about microcredentials. The literature showed that there are two main diverging opinions on whether these learning activities need to be clearly defined or there needs to be flexibility in how these learning activities are designed and delivered. In the light of these discussions, we have found that learning activities of already existing microcredentials vary in their length, difficulty, and work efforts, as well as assignment practices, quality assurance practices, and the quality in how the learning outcomes are described. The study found that there is a wide variety of providers of microcredentials, which have also to some extent influenced that these differences exist. Learning activities leading to microcredentials offered by universities are often part of lifelong learning and continuous professional development centers, and they serve as supplementary standalone credentials. The study has also found that digital learning is becoming more relevant, and courses leading to microcredentials are increasingly offered online, but it does not mean that other forms of delivery do not apply to microcredentials. The online learning sector has been accelerating in the last few years with the growth of MOOC platforms such as Coursera, edX, Udacity, and FutureLearn. Classcenter, for example, reported that over 2,500 individual courses, 170 microcredentials, and 11 online degree courses were launched in 2019 alone. These platforms offer learners credentials from some of the best universities without learners having to actually attend these universities. And we have seen that the pandemic has also contributed to this acceleration in enrollments on these platforms, as well as strengthened cooperation between online learning platforms and some of the best universities. We have also found that even though learning activities leading to micro-credentials vary a lot, this is not a major issue and it can bring substantial benefits and innovations into the education system. However, it is important that micro-credentials are well designed and understandable by all interested parties. For this reason, micro-credentials must include a concise summary of critical information elements, which indicates the certified learning and the conditions under which it was achieved. Similarly to the traditional qualifications, for example, in the form of the diploma supplement. Such information packs ensure that learners and employers are well informed about exactly what micro-credentials communicate about the holders. This information can be included into the paper or digital micro-credential itself. Ensuring that this information about micro-credentials is transparent and informative can build trust among learners and employers, and also facilitate the greater uptake of these micro-credentials. As you can see in this slide, we have identified a rather long list of critical information elements of micro-credentials that can be included in it. These include the title of a micro-credential, which precisely signal learning outcomes, a provider of a micro-credential, a date when micro-credential was issued, also a description of a course content and its purpose, the learning outcomes that were achieved, also the type of participation, the number of credits gained, type of assessment, quality assurance aspects such as a body ensuring the quality assurance of the content of a learning activity, integration and stackability options, whether it is a standalone certificate or it can be stacked to a larger qualification, and the type of supervision, which can be unsupervised with no identity verification or supervised online on-site with identity verification. Even though we have provided a long list of these critical information elements, it does not necessarily mean that all of these elements have to be included in a micro-credential, but there are several of these that are particularly important in any type of certification, such as a clear title, which precisely signals learning outcomes themselves, a provider, the number of credits gained, the type of assessment and the result of the assessment, as well as the quality assurance. Quality assurance has been mentioned a few times today, and it is of great importance when it comes to the establishment and recognition of education, which includes learning activities leading to micro-credentials. One of the main successes of the Bologna process is the establishment of quality assurance as a key element of higher education. There is a consensus that quality assurance is necessary to ensure accountability and support enhancement in education. It also gives confidence to learners and other users of the credential, such as employers and universities, that courses or modules or other different types of short learning activities adhere to the state-of-the-art principles with regard to the development, design, delivery, assessment, overall management, and enhancement. For this reason, it is necessary to extend national quality assurance processes and regulations to micro-credentials in both internal and external quality assurance. Micro-credentials obtained from accredited higher education institutions through quality-assured short learning courses present fewer challenges to being recognized, both for further learning and for employability. The study has also found that the introduction and the use of micro-credentials is not an objective itself, More importantly, they need to be seen as tools to actually enhance the existing qualification systems by making them the tools for giving value to and recognizing prior and newly gained knowledge, skills, and competences, thus making these more visible as well as encouraging learning and motivating lifelong learning. Recognition of prior learning is still a complicated matter in many contexts, and using micro-credentials can add on to existing practices. Prior learning is often gained through employment and voluntary work, and can often include only limited or very specific knowledge, skills, and competences. So allowing learners to receive a proof of these would be beneficial to them. This could be assessed on assessing the specific knowledge, skills, and competences and issuing a micro-credential that shows that a learner actually has these. In addition to this, allowing learners to receive a proof of gaining some specific knowledge, skills, and competences that are relevant to their personal professional lives after participating in a shorter learning activity that they can engage in their free time can motivate them to be more engaged in lifelong learning. As the study shows, learners, especially who are already in employment or have family responsibilities, tend to not engage in full qualifications, as it is not compatible to their availability. They often require quick, on-demand, and flexible learning opportunities. The study did not only look into what microcredentials are, but also why microcredentials are gaining attention and what drives the use of microcredentials in higher education. The growing popularity of microcredentials is an outcome of competing societal and economic forces and macro-level trends, which reflect changing perspectives in what individuals, employers, and the governments expect from higher education. It encompasses a number of competing perspectives on how higher education should be responding to the emergence of new digital society in order to ensure a well-educated citizenry with 21st century skills that can help to shape a prosperous future. Set against this wider backdrop, perhaps the most significant micro-level trend is the changing nature of the labor market and growing uncertainty as to what the future of work will look like. Alongside this powerful driver is a greater recognition on the part of individuals that the skills that they have acquired in formal education are not future-proof, leading them to look for ways to gain new skills, or perhaps even reskill in order to change their field of work. Another major driver is the growing use of microcredentials and increasing accessibility of top-level education, particularly as a result of the advancement of digital education tools. Digital education tools offer new ways to deliver learning activities and have the potential to meet the growing demand for higher education that responds to the needs of new digital society. The previously discussed changing learner needs play an important role when talking about the main purposes of microcredentials, as well as the potential impacts. The growth of new learning formats, such as learning activities leading to microcredentials, is particularly relevant in the light of fast-changing technological developments as well as changing job roles and requirements. They drive the need to upskill, reskill, or gain new skills and knowledge for individuals in order to ensure better employability opportunities. Despite an increasing number of employers beginning to support additional learning on the part of their employees, many learners still prefer to learn at their own convenience. As a result, learners who prefer to learn in their free time might favor shorter learning opportunities. Breaking down lifelong personal and professional development into smaller, more discrete moments and milestones of observable achievement for busy adults seem to be very useful. These learners might get discouraged or lose momentum when there is only a single defined endpoint way off on the horizon, versus valuable milestones of recognition along the way of their careers and lives. Learners' needs are changing, and they increasingly demand flexible and personalized education via flexible curricular and also flexible learning pathways. Learners are also increasingly seeking knowledge on demand, which allows them to access knowledge, skills, and competencies when it is actually necessary. There are no more jobs for life, and employers demand flexibility and quick reactions to changing circumstances. Alternative higher education pathways, including microcredentials, can fill the gap between the programs provided by higher education institutions and the skills that employers actually seeking from the employees. For instance, when the report is being prepared, the Coimbra Group of Universities and the German Rectors Conference have issued a collective outlook in which they express support for more flexible and modular programs and for recognition by means of microcredentials in the light of the crisis and the pandemic. According to them, the use of microcredentials by higher education providers has the potential to foster continuous learning, to fill the knowledge and skill gaps, to increase the efficiency of higher education systems, to encourage innovation in educational provision, and reach a diverse group of learners. The study has shown that microcredentials are beneficial as standalone certifications. They complement or supplement degree programs, which can lead to greater employability, and they can also improve the level of lifelong learning. But beyond this emerging consensus that there are benefits to microcredentials, some challenges still exist in terms of scaling up the use of microcredentials. Learners are yet to adopt microcredentials on a wider scale because they might still be unsure about the benefits that they offer. For example, they are not sure about the extent to which microcredentials are recognized by employers. And employers are still unsure what microcredentials are and which ones they should trust, given that the wide variations in their characteristics exist. Higher education institutions also face several challenges in relation to the uptake of microcredentials, namely the recognition of microcredentials within the existing curricula, quality assurance constraints that exist in some cases, as well as the lack of funding support and a lack of adequately trained teaching staff that can actually implement it. The lack of a common understanding of microcredentials inhibits quality assurance processes and standards, while the short length of the courses that lead to microcredentials discourages some institutions from actually allocating time and human resources to the development of such short learning activities that could lead to microcredentials. The main obstacles to the wider use of microcredentials at system level were identified as being the complexity of microcredential offerings, lack of digital solutions for assessment, validation, recognition, and storage of microcredentials, the resistance from some stakeholders in the use of microcredentials, among few to mention. However, our research showed that none of these barriers mentioned above are insurmountable, and they can all be overcome if European educators and policymakers adopt a coherent and consistent approach to microcredentials. Our study has also explored the EU policy context and how microcredentials fit within it. In the light of changing education and training landscape and the emergence and wider use of different types of credentials, the European Commission brought forward the idea of microcredentials in vocational education and training, as well as higher education. In 2020, the European Commission presented its vision for the creation of a European education area to be achieved by 2025. And it announced concrete measures to achieve this along 6 dimensions. A European approach to microcredentials is integrated to achieving the second dimension of it, which is based on the inclusion and gender equality. Also, through adoption of the European Skills Agenda for Sustainable Competitiveness, Social Fairness and Resilience, the European Commission is placing skills at the heart of the EU policy agenda, steering investment in people and these skills for sustainable growth and recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic. The agenda contains 12 pillars, with one of them devoted specifically to the importance of microcredentials. Additionally, through its Digital Education Action Plan, the European Commission also emphasizes the necessity to promote inclusive and accessible digital education in Europe in terms of digital education content, tools and platforms for it. According to the Commission, these efforts are expected to encourage uptake, quality assurance, validation, and recognition of short courses and learning opportunities in all sectors of education and training. This can be supported through microcredentials, which can capture the learning outcomes of short learning activity. Also, when our study was prepared, there was a Microcredentials higher education consultation group, which discussed the main aspects of a European approach and how microcredentials could fit into that. After the publication of our report, another major milestone was achieved in the European context. At the end of 2021, the European Commission presented proposal for Council recommendations on individual learning accounts and microcredentials, which was announced in the Skills Agenda and in the European Education Area Communication of 2020. The proposal aims to enable individuals to acquire knowledge, skills, and competencies that they need to thrive in an evolving labor market and society, and to support education providers to foster inclusiveness and equal opportunities in education and training. To achieve these objectives, the proposal established a European approach recommending that Member States apply a common EU definition, standards, and key principles for designing and issuing microcredential. This proposal will be further negotiated with the Member States. In addition to actions taken by the European Commission, microcredentials are also being explored in the context of the Bologna process. Within the framework of Erasmus Plus Microlevel project, the Bologna follow-up group tasked 3 working groups with looking at microcredentials from the perspective of key commitments within the Bologna process, which are first, quality assurance, second, recognition, and third, qualification frameworks and the European Credits Transfer and Accumulation System, ECTS. The main goal of Macrolevel is to explore whether and how these existing Bologna tools can be used or adapted to be applicable to microcredentials through engaging different ministries and other stakeholders. The project is coordinated by the Flemish Ministry of Education and Training in partnership with the Ministry of Education and Culture of Finland, Information Center on Academic Mobility and Equivalence of Italy, the European University Association, the European Association for Quality Assurance in Higher Education, and associated partner, the Quality Assurance Register for Higher Education. The main output of the project will be a proposal for a common European framework for microcredentials, which will be presented later this year. As previously mentioned, our study also included 3 case studies, one of them being microcredentials in New Zealand's education and training system. So in 2018, New Zealand's Qualifications Authority has introduced microcredentials into its regulated education and training system. According to the New Zealand's Qualification Authority, a microcredential certifies the achievement of a coherent set of skills and knowledge, is specified by a statement of purpose, learning outcomes, and strong evidence of need by industry, employers, Maori society, or the community. They are smaller than qualification. They focus on skills development opportunities that are not currently catered for within the regulated tertiary education system, and they usually have a very practical focus and largely concern the vocational education and training sector. Microcredentials can be provided by tertiary education organizations, universities, employers, and professional bodies, either directly or in partnership with tertiary education providers. In general, microcredentials are subject to the same requirements as other training schemes that exist under New Zealand's education and training system. But they also need to adhere to some other more specific aspects. First, they have to be 5 to 40 credits in size, which is New Zealand's credits. If you would convert that to the equivalent of ECTS, it would be between 2.5 and 20 ECTS credits. They also need to show strong evidence of need from employers, the industry, and the community. They cannot duplicate other quality assured learning which is approved by the New Zealand's Qualifications Authority, and they need to be reviewed annually to confirm that they continue to meet the intended purposes. After these microcredentials are reviewed and approved, they are published on a microcredential register. The register where microcredentials are being registered is searchable by a keyword, by a name of a developer, or also by the education organization's number. The information which is available in the register includes the title, the level in the qualifications framework, number of credits, institutional developer's name, the approval date, the review date, the main aim and outcome. Here you can see an example of one of microcredentials published in this register. In addition to more technical details, such as the title, credits, the dates, it clearly states also the learning outcomes to be gained after finishing the course leading to a microcredential. And in this slide, you can see the example of the course, which is titled Introduction to Inshore Commercial Fishing. You can see that it is level 2 in the qualifications framework, and the learner will be awarded 40 credits after completing this course. The aim of the course is to provide the commercial fishing industry with entry-level personnel who have the knowledge and skills needed to work on an inshore commercial fishing vessel. So you can see that it has a very specific aim, and it also lists the main learning outcomes that the learner will be able to prove after they are issued this microcredential. In addition to mapping exercise and looking into what microcredentials are, the main benefits and obstacles in the implementation of microcredentials, we also wanted to look into the factors that would ensure the success of the European approach for microcredentials. So in order to see whether the European approach to microcredentials is beneficial and creates European added value, we suggested asking the following question, which is, how will we know if the European approach to microcredentials has succeeded? If we can imagine what the key success factors will look like, it will be easier to assess whether or not we have achieved them. Also, to ensure genuine European added value, the European approach needs to be achieved through collaboration and discussion among the main stakeholders in the field of higher education. Actions by the European Commission should work in synergy with national policies and the work done by higher education institutions. The study found that the success of a European approach to microcredentials will largely mean the following key changes. First, it would increase trust in microcredentials across all social systems, which include education and training system, the labor market, and the society at large. Second, it would enhance transparency of learning outcomes achieved as a result of short learning courses. Third, it would strengthen educational innovation as a result of a common approach. And lastly, it would enhance flexibility for all learners in choosing the most suitable learning pathways for themselves. Increased trust in alternative credentials would mean more job adverts from employers that emphasize skills and competencies that can be evidenced and documented using microcredentials, as well as more adults engaging in lifelong learning. Enhanced transparency would mean that all microcredentials in Europe should present certain key information elements about the learning process and the learning outcomes achieved as a result of these short learning processes. A European approach should also foster educational innovation, not least by enhancing trust in alternative credentials and the transparency of information provided therein. Among the key risks associated with creating any new policy framework is that of unintentionally limiting certain activities that fall outside the scope of the framework, which is why it is important that it does not inhibit on the educational innovation. Ultimately, with increased trust, transparency, and a framework that supports educational innovations, a new ecosystem should emerge that fosters increased flexibility for all learners in choosing learning pathways that are in line with their goals and needs in the labor market and society at large. If a common approach enables flexible learning pathways, it will contribute to the achievement of EU policy objectives to ensure that higher education is of high quality, inclusive, and suitable for lifelong learning. So this is the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you all for joining the session and listening to my presentation. And I will be happy to answer your questions.